Right, so number 5 would have to be this guy, Jonathan Slinger, who was playing Macbeth in Stratford-upon-Avon when he said in an interview that he didn't really go in for all of that Macbeth curse stuff. He thought it was nonsense, didn't stand for it, despite the fact that he'd already been injured twice on set. And then a few weeks later, he had to pull out after he was hit by a car. Now, I don't like to make a habit of laughing at road accidents, despite what you may have heard, but there's something just so vicious and judicial about that one that I had to include it. It's just so Macbeth. Right, so number 4 gives us our first death of the list. Now, I'm not here to make light of people dying and that kind of thing. That's why I didn't include the Astor riots, which you may have heard of, quite a famous and violent riot that broke out following a feud between two actors who were both playing Macbeth in New York. There was fighting in the streets and at least 20 people died. But in this case, just one person dies. So to borrow a phrase from Stalin, 20 deaths is really sad, but just one's quite funny. This is Percy Hammond, who was a theatre critic, and he wrote a scathing review of a young Orson Welles production of Macbeth, known as his Voodoo Macbeth. He had an all-black cast, and it featured lots of voodoo magic. And following the review, one of the cast put a kind of voodoo spell on the critic, and he died a few days later. The reason it gets onto the list is it's a rare example of the Macbeth curse moving out of the immediate theatre crew and actually attacking the critics. Usually it's reserved for actors and people involved in the production, but this is an example of the cast actually weaponizing the Macbeth curse, so that's why it gets points from me. Number 3 takes us to 1942, John Gielgud's production of Macbeth, in which 3 members of the cast lost their lives. One of them died on stage, and there was also I believe it was a stage manager or a costume designer who committed suicide. So 4 deaths in the production, 3 in the cast. Now, if it was a production that used the same amount of actors as they would have in Shakespeare's day, with about half the number of named roles and all the cast members doubling up, that means there would be a death rate of about 25 to 30%. Which, just to put that into context for you, you would have better odds of survival if you had fought for Britain in World War I. For the sheer starkness of the figures alone, Gielgud's 42 production makes it to number 3. Number 2 is Alec Baldwin, who in 1998, playing Macbeth, he managed to slice open Macduff's hand. The actor playing Macduff got his hand completely cut open in their duel scene. Luckily, he didn't bleed to death or anything. And from that day on, Alec Baldwin swore that he would be extra careful from now on when it came to prop weapons. Before I reveal my number 1 pick, here are 2 honourable mentions. The first one is Abraham Lincoln, who on the 9th of April 1865 was reciting passages from Macbeth for some friends. Less than a week later, he made the fatal mistake of visiting a theatre where, of course, the Macbeth curse struck and shot him in the back of the head. And for my second honourable mention, we go from one esteemed American theatre to another. At last year's Oscars, the comedian Chris Rock made the mistake of naming the Scottish play on stage in front of an audience. Macbeth! And moments later, the Macbeth curse took up residence in the right hand of Will Smith, whereupon the Fresh Prince himself, King Richard, walked across the stage as if compelled by supernatural forces and smote Chris Rock where he stood. And finally, number 1, without a shadow of a doubt, is Charlton Heston, who in the early to mid-1950s, I believe, was performing as Macbeth when his tights burst into flames. I don't have the full details on this. I've come across a few passing references to it here and there. I've heard a reference to kerosene. I've heard a reference to superficial burns to the groin. And I actually don't want to know any more than that. It's a magical story as it is. I know nobody lost their lives or got seriously hurt. So I'm happy to let any other details just remain a beautiful mystery. So there you have it, my top 5 incidences of the Macbeth curse striking. Nothing else to say really, other than hot potato orchestra stalls, puck will make amends.